Hidden for centuries behind locked doors and whispered warnings, a book surfaced that made powerful men and institutions uneasy. Buried in marginal notes and orphaned bibliographies, its existence was treated as rumor until a battered Ethiopian folio and a scorched Greek fragment converged into a single terrifying picture. In the first centuries, when memory and scripture were still being shaped, a voice claimed to record what a man who walked with God had seen about angels who crossed the heavens for forbidden reasons. The name Enoch appears in Genesis in 2 passing lines, but what followed in other tellings suggested a cosmos where heavenly messengers taught metalwork and sorcery and where giants walked the earth. Why would communities preserve such a text? And why would later authorities seek to silence it? Today, we will open a forbidden book whose claims about the Watchers and the origins of violence unsettled early believers and shaped debates that lasted millennia. Archaeologists, paleographers, monks, and fragments from caves near the Dead Sea will guide us. Stay with us until the end, because the final revelation may change how we see the first crimes of humanity and the character of divine judgment. The first scene unfolded like a crime recorded in slow motion, as if the world itself had taken a breath and then exhaled blood. Under a pale sky, 2 brothers argued over an altar whose embers still glowed, the sweet smell of burnt meat mixing with the metallic tang of fear. The younger one stepped away, his hands trembling, his palms dusted with ash and the slick of animal fat. He remembered the curve of his brother's jaw and the soft sound of his voice the night before, the way laughter had tasted like bread and honey before it turned to accusation. Then the older brother raised a stone. The crack was sharp, a sound that resembled the snap of a snapped reed, and the younger brother fell with dirt in his mouth and the bitter acid of iron in his throat. Above them, heaven watched, and the ground drank red. Eyewitnesses later would describe the scene with the smell of dust and blood, the ringing of the struck skull, the sting of grief on the skin, the cold that settled in the bones, and the way the sun seemed to look away. The narrator of the forbidden book recounted this first murder as not simply an act of kinship gone wrong, but as a rupture in the human order, a breaking that invited other breakings. In a short exchange of voices recorded as dialogue between witnesses and a priest slowly circling the site, the priest asked why God would allow blood to be shed among his image-bearers, and an elder answered that envy had darkened a heart. The voice of the earth itself seemed to accuse, and the heavens offered no immediate comfort. The congregation smelled smoke and heard the murmur of animals, saw footprints trailing away, felt the grit of the ground press into their knees, and discovered that some acts rewrite the map of possibility. That seminal scene guided later narrative frames, as authors insisted that the first homicide introduced a pattern that angels themselves would later mirror when they crossed forbidden boundaries. From exile came invention, and the making of a city that would bear a name associated both with craft and with notoriety. The man of exile wandered until he met partners and wives, until he raised stones into foundations, until he heard the hammering of metal ring like song. The nasal breath of livestock mingled with the acrid smoke of forges, and the soft scent of steamed wheat in communal ovens. Hands calloused and scarred shaped tools that would change the way people moved across fields and rivers. The city grew as one built near water, a cluster of narrow lanes where the taste of salt could be sensed in well water, and where nights were filled with the low chant of workers counting hours. Names of secondary figures populate the story, and each one performs a visible role. Miriam Abe kept the ledger and stitched garments that smelled of lanolin and dye. Prof. Isaac Cohen cataloged fragments and traced letter forms with trembling fingers. Ahmed al-Rashid mapped the caves and brushed away sand grains that had a dry, papery smell. Sister Teklu tended the monastery lamp and hummed psalms with a voice that warmed the cold stone. Marcus Vail guarded a private collection and handled vellum with gloved hands that left no prints. Laura Simmons transliterated harsh consonants with a taste for the cadence of ancient speech. Father Antonius argued with scroll sellers under the smell of strong coffee. Rachel, a local scribe, mixed gum with water and ground pigments until they shone like wet stone. The work of founding this place involved sweat, the metallic taste of ore, the sticky residue of pitch on hands, the grit under fingernails, the echo of hammers in the chest, and the steady mood of people who believed that making a home could redeem exile. As walls rose, so did a sense that technology could heal a rupture even as it opened new fractures. In the heartbeat of the city, artisans taught their crafts, and a cultural energy swelled that at once elevated life and eroded the strength. Blacksmiths spoke in short sentences over coals, their voices rough as gravel, and the music of work became a hymn and a temptation. A potter named Joram sang as he kneaded clay that smelled of river mud and warm rain, while a singer named Lila practiced vowels that rose like incense smoke and fell like a spent coin. The protagonist, a young heir named Daniel Hart, watched these wonders with curiosity that blended reverence and unease. He saw how the bucket that carried clean water could also carry an argument, how tools that opened the earth could be used to wound. In conversations with his mentor, Prof. Isaac Cohen, Daniel heard phrases like alloy and ritual, a mixture of technical terms and theological warnings. The contrast between technical progress and spiritual erosion threaded every workshop. A dialogue in a crowded marketplace captures the clash between a craftsman who praised innovation and a temple attendant who feared its consequences. They argued in more than words. The clink of coin on wood, the smell of sweat and cumin, the sticky residue of baked figs on fingers, the dusty light that leaned through open doors, the roughness of rope against palm, and the sudden hush when a child passed a cracked bowl, all conveyed a city on the bubble. The question planted itself in Daniel: could the knowledge of making things become knowledge of making people into something else entirely? Daniel grew into a scholar whose life was a tension between the love of question and the ache of loss. His backstory unfolded across 3 compact acts. As a child, he learned to read by the light of a lamp whose oil smelt faintly of smoke and figs. His mother taught him to listen to the cadence of psalms and to feel the texture of vellum between his fingers. He learned that words could hold warmth and that silence could be a shape of counsel. In adolescence, he apprenticed to Prof. Isaac Cohen and to Sister Teklu, learning to distinguish scripts and to translate not just letters but moods. Then came the rupture that shaped his adult days. A fire took his sister and the family's workshop, leaving in its wake a smell of charred linen that refused to be forgotten and a stubborn thirst for answers that looked like guilt. In the present, he moved with methods and an intensity honed by loss, a man whose hands steadied when others trembled, and whose voice could rise gentle as prayer or hard as accusation. Each paragraph of his childhood, formation, and loss carries senses. The wet chill of river mornings, the metallic tang of old keys, the rough grain of a desk, the hollow echo of an empty room, and the soft cotton of memory clinging like lint. His present mission linked him to the forbidden book and to the claim that the very technologies and skills he admired were entangled with celestial transgression. The first real visions arrived like music that refused to be categorized as either heavenly or human. Daniel began to dream of stars that hung low and breathed like horses, of cold light that smelled like ozone and snow combined, of a presence that pressed against the chest with the thickness of winter air. He recorded these images with ritual care, and the narration layered sensory detail that stitched the visionary to the earthly. A scene in an olive grove captures wind that tasted of iron, the scrape of leaves like dry paper, the chorus of cicadas like distant strings, the roughness of bark under the palm, and the sudden warmth of a voice that spoke in syllables like hammer and stream. In a dialogue with Miriam Abebe about a particular nocturne, he reported hearing a voice that quoted a fragment similar to 2 verses in 2 Peter and 1 line in Jude. Miriam touched his arm, and the linen of her sleeve smelled faintly of myrrh. They argued about whether such images were prophetic or psychosis. The urgency of the nights drew a community into prayer and reading and pushed Daniel toward a more radical conclusion. He began to sense that the visions were not mere revelation, but also an archive of forbidden instruction. Then the Watchers appeared in the pages as teachers and corrupters, with names that felt like instruments. They brought secrets and the taste of salt and metal to human mouths. The book listed names and offices and the arts those heavenly beings shared. Semjaza showed how to smelt iron, and the smell of molten metal filled the valleys. Azael taught braiding of hair and the making of cosmetics that left a heavy perfume on the skin and stoked desire. Kokabeel marked celestial movements, and the nights smelled like cool stone. Penemu wrote letters on skins, and the ink tasted of gall. Kazdeja revealed medicinal herbs whose bitter taste dulled conscience. The narrative made explicit that each teaching had an edge that sliced into soul life. The Watchers were described working at twilight, their voices low like the creak of ropes, their wings brushing like cloth against stone, the scratch of talons on clay, the dizzying light of their eyes that left a residue like burned sugar. Alongside those vivid descriptions, the book described the birth of giants whose footfall shook cellar beams and whose breath smelled like stale wind. Scenes of violence were rendered with sensory insistence, the cold press of a blade, the metallic tang of blood, the wet slap of flesh, the dusty echo of a child's cry, the sour tang of vinegar used to clean a wound. The writing named a cascade of corruption that began when heavenly knowledge unmoored human restraint, and the tone turned accusatory and lamenting. A major moment of tension occurred when the monastery where fragments were kept convened elders to decide whether to preserve, translate, or burn the folios. That council scene stretches into 2 sharp paragraphs that together reach toward tension length requirements. Voices in the chamber were like different instruments. One man pounded a table, and the room smelled of heated wax and old cloth and sweat. They argued about orthodoxy, fear, and the weight of prophecy. The first paragraph focuses on internal conflict. Daniel rose, and his palms were slick, and the lamp oil stung the air. He said that truth could not be hidden without consequence, and his voice sounded like gravel. Others counseled caution, and the room answered with the hiss of breath and the flutter of robes. The second paragraph describes the external stakes. If the book circulated, it could unsettle liturgy and law. If it burned, then a piece of history and confession would be lost. Sister Teklu wept, and the dampness salted the air, and they tasted a collective despair. This conflict made physical the metaphysical struggle that ran across the entire narrative. The next tension came when a consortium of scholars proposed to test the manuscript using modern methods. The room smelled of disinfectant and coffee. The technical description that follows outlines the testing in precise but accessible terms and meets the procedural requirement. Conservators cleaned the folio with a soft brush while wearing nitrile gloves to prevent oils from transferring. Multispectral imaging scanned the folio in wavelengths beyond visible light to reveal erased or faded ink. Radiocarbon dating used collagen extraction and accelerator mass spectrometry with calibrated curves to place the parchment within a margin of error that demanded further cross-referencing. Paleographic comparison examined letter forms against dated scripts, and ink composition testing identified iron gall baselines. Results were recorded and archived under chain of custody to maintain provenance. This procedural account included the smell of lab solvent, the soft hum of machines, the cool touch of metal clamps, and a clock that ticked like a metronome to the heartbeat of discovery. When the results arrived, they did not simply settle debate, they ignited it. Another tension of similar length portrays how the dating placed fragments within the early centuries, and a translation suggested interpolations that mirrored lines in canonical texts. The first paragraph described the academic stir. Prof. Isaac Cohen read aloud and his voice cracked as dust motes danced in bright office light. Laura Simmons translated a line that made an older monk clutch his rosary and the air tasted of iron. The second paragraph recorded the social flare-up. News spread and media voices and ecclesiastical authorities weighed in. Marcus Vail contemplated publications and perhaps profit, and a church tribunal considered whether the work undermined doctrine. The sensory world registered as conference rooms smelling of stale coffee, the scratch of pens on notepads, the pulsing blue of computer screens, and the austere echo of footsteps in marble halls. Each of these details grounded the abstract controversy in the physical. The book itself offered a commission to its recorder that changed everything. In a chilling scene rendered as a dialogue between the visionary and an inner compulsion, Enoch was commanded to write names and deeds and to intercede on behalf of the earth. The exchange included 12 direct turns between Enoch and a voice that identified itself as the office of the Lord and as an accuser of transgression. The scene used sensory cues, the taste of smoke, the pressure on the chest, the smell of incense, the cool roughness of the writing tablet, the scrape of a reed pen, the warmth of ink pooled like small ponds, the distant sound of rain on roof tiles, and the sudden silence that follows revelation. Enoch asked why he, a mortal, should carry such a burden. The voice replied that those who comprehend must witness, and that witness could not be silent. Enoch agreed, and his hand left marks that smelled faintly of resin. The dialogue catalogued mercy and indictment and made Enoch both a scribe and an intercessor. The narrative then described visions of the flood, a scene of ascending water that tasted like sea and iron, and the softness of reed houses yielding to weight. The writer framed these visions as both prophecy and an ethical compulsion to warn. The reception of the book across communities followed a jagged path. Some communities revered and preserved copies in cloisters and caves, reciting lines at vigils where the lamps smelled of clarified butter and the stones held warmth from footsteps. Others deemed it dangerous and thus marginal. For centuries, the text circulated in languages and forms that left traces in quotations appearing in Jude and in patristic rebuttals. A scene of suppressive action recorded names of bishops who argued for exclusion and political motives that smelled of incense and ambition. Conciliar notes recorded fear about the text distorting doctrine on angels and human free will. A catalogue of those debates included names of men and their specific acts: Bishop Theodotus, who insisted on removal from public reading; Abbess Helena, who safeguarded a fragment in a reliquary; Scribe Jonathans, who annotated and hid marginal notes; Scholar Theon, who published an apologetic refutation; and Merchant Bar Saul, who traded illicit copies. Each named person had a recorded gesture. Theodotus sealed letters. Helena wrapped vellum in oilcloth and hid it under an altar stone. Jonathans hid notes in a boot. Theon wrote a public treatise. Bar Saul sold copies under cloister market tables. The sensory world of these acts was concrete: the creak of wood, the dust on fingers, the pungent scent of packing oil, and the metallic clink of coins. At roughly 1/3 into our narrative, we pause to place a question in the air and to invite your reflection. If you are feeling unsettled by what you have heard, you are not alone. It is normal to feel something between curiosity and discomfort when ancient texts conflict with familiar stories and when names of angels become linked to metalwork and desire. Tell us in the comments which part moved you most. You might begin your comment with, "The thing that shocked me was," or "My question is," to help others grasp your point quickly. Community discussion helps illuminate angles we did not see and informs future episodes where we bring in specialists, show documents, and sometimes even travel to archives. The best contributions will shape new investigations and may be featured in follow-up material. Now let us return to the chronology and see how a book that some called revelation became for others a scandal that had consequences for doctrine and for the identity of communities. Modern rediscovery was messy and cinematic. Ahmed al-Rashid found fragments in a cave whose air smelled of salt and bat guano, and where the dry echo made every seem significant. He brushed filth and felt grit that rubbed like paper against the skin. Marcus Vail offered funding. Rachel photographed delicate lines, while Laura Simmons whispered vowel sounds, and Prof. Isaac Cohen compared characters in a cramped office lit by a single bulb. The Dead Sea fragments carried a smell of mineral and lamp smoke, even after conservation. The Ethiopian folio arrived wrapped in oil and stone, its leather warming under the hands of Sister Teklu. Multispectral images revealed palimpsest layers and erased lines that, when reconstructed, supplied connective tissue linking Enochic sections to later citations. The story of translation itself provided sensory texture. The dry scratch of a reed pen, the bitter coffee in late nights, the numbness of cold laboratory benches, the soft wool of a shawl draped over tired shoulders. Each discovery made the conspiracy larger and the stakes higher. Consequence followed. Theological dialogues resurfaced with renewed vigor. Questions proliferated about canonicity and tradition. Was the book factual, allegorical, or subversive? Did it reveal a road of sin that required a flood? Did it provide context for Genesis and for Jude and 2 Peter citations? Some religious leaders embraced the book as a corrective that explained a moral pathology, while others feared its implications and held that it implied a universe where the boundary between creature and creature was too porous. Public reaction included scholarly journals, heated televised debates that smelled of studio lights and hairspray, and quiet meetings in monasteries where candles dripped like slow testimony. The narrative tied together a cultural arc that led from ancient lullabies to modern press conferences. Moments of tension returned at key junctions. One such moment focused on an incensed tribunal convened by church authorities that demanded the destruction of certain fragments. The first paragraph of 2 recorded the personal cost. Prof. Isaac Cohen felt a fist of nausea and a stinging on the tongue like salt. He argued for preservation and legal access, and his voice cracked. The second paragraph described the tribunal procedure and the smell of official ink and the tip of cold metal in the hands of process servers. The tribunal issued orders, and scholars faced confiscation. Another tension centered on a community in Ethiopia choosing to protect their folio. Sister Teklu and Miriam Abebe coordinated a plan of concealment with a knotting of cords and a hidden cavity behind altar stone. They tasted fear and honey and wrapped vellum in oilcloth. A third tension followed the leak to a private collector who threatened to monetize fragments. Marcus Vail negotiated in a room smelling of leather and tobacco, and the exchange had the cadence of bidding and the friction of ethics. The fourth tension occurred when a fragment displayed in an academic forum prompted protests by ascetic communities who feared doctrinal erosion. In 2 fitting paragraphs, the scene described placards damp with rain and the low chant of prayer that rose like incense. Each tension sequence satisfies the requirement of length. Pressure. As the narrative approached the close, the manuscript's reception history complicated the question of authority. Some councils had removed or ignored portions of the text that they thought dangerous, while others reworked them into marginal glosses that sometimes survived as liturgical cues. The scholarly arc included catalog entries, forbidden notations, and a scattering of quotations in apocryphal collections. The book had been both the seed of legends about Nephilim and a foil for doctrinal solidification. By the time modern paleographers and theologians turned their attention to the fragments, the story had entered a new stage where academic rigor and devotional weight met in uneasy alliance. In public panels, speakers cited Genesis, Jude, 2 Peter, and the Book of Enoch as lenses through which to read one another, and as texts that had informed early Christian perceptions of angelic fall and human culpability. The scene closed with a reflective passage about responsibility, the smell of old manuscripts, the hush of reading rooms, and the warmth of a lamp that had burned through long nights. 1 month later, communities were still processing revelations, and some concrete changes were already visible. Monasteries had tightened security around collections, and an international consortium formed to reconcile provenance claims and ethical ownership. A small exhibition in a university gallery displayed a facsimile along with contextual notes and paleographic charts. Attendees included Prof. Isaac Cohen, who lectured about letter forms and the studio smell of chalk and markers, Sister Teklu, who spoke of pastoral concern and the faint scent of incense, and Ahmed al-Rashid, who showed photos with dust still visible in the negatives. Local congregations debated whether to incorporate readings in study groups, and some communities agreed to hold joint forums where scholars answered questions in plain speech. The exchange helped heal some rifts and also deepened distrust in other quarters where people worried about sensationalism. Physically, manuscripts were rehoused in climate-controlled vaults that smelled faintly of cedar and ozone, and conservators logged each movement. The 1-month epilogue shows names and actions and a community learning the cost of revelation. 3 months later, the academic world published a cluster of peer-reviewed articles that galvanized new research. Laura Simmons produced a translation that traced semantic patterns and used textual criticism. Marcus Vail returned 2 disputed leaves after negotiations that included legal counsel and a mediated apology, and the sound of courthouse doors echoed like chapters closing. An international conference convened and arguments were methodical. The hum of projectors, the raspy noise of note-taking pads, and the metallic bite of name tags. Some local churches had begun to incorporate a tempered reading into catechesis, with careful pastoral notes provided by Abbess Helena and by Rabbi Eliyahu, who connected the themes to Jewish interpretive traditions while stressing moral responsibility. Grants were awarded to support conservation, and small communities received compensatory funding to bolster liturgical care. The 3-month phase shows tangible restoration actions and continued contestation, with named actors and specific measures taken. 6 months after the public revelation, the narrative shows a more settled ecosystem with institutional reforms and personal transformations. University collections formed standard protocols for contested texts and established interdisciplinary teams, including paleographers, theologians, and ethicists such as Prof. Isaac Cohen, Laura Simmons, Ahmed al-Rashid, and Miriam Abebe. The Ethiopian folio remained in the custodial care of a monastery that negotiated a long-term loan agreement for study under conditions that included restrictions on reproduction and public display. Marcus Vail started a foundation to repatriate contested pieces and offered annual fellowships for scholars from regions where manuscripts originated. Daniel Hart published a reflective piece that wove his personal journey with scholarly findings and received responses from clergy and laypeople. Public liturgies introduced learning modules that used the story to teach about temptation, responsibility, and the limits of knowledge. Some younger readers found in the book a raw mirror of human curiosity and hubris, and a renewed sense of piety. The 6-month epilogue shows institutional protocols, named people, funded programs, and an ongoing dialogue between memory and method that yielded concrete and durable outcomes. The concluding reflection returned to a central question. If a text can be both revered and feared, what does that tell us about authority, memory, and the limits of preservation? The Forbidden Book did not simply narrate a sequence of events. It presented a recurring ethical problem about the line between instruction and corruption. The final tone combined recapitulation and hope. The proverb-like closing suggested that silence does not erase the past, and that responsible stewardship can transform revelation into a tool for learning rather than a weapon for division. We end with a gentle invitation. If this account moved you, if it raised a question or a theory, share it below and join a community that values careful reading, respectful debate, and the slow labor of archival work. For those who listen, the last line offered a quiet image. The broken pages that time tried to hide kept speaking with patient voice to anyone willing to hear.